for workplace mindfulness programs, the relevant thing for you to be aware of is the existence of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, or the EEOC. And it's their job, among other things, to interpret and apply the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which specifically focuses on issues of religious discrimination. And so there are two types of discrimination that section talks about. And one of them is direct discrimination, which is when an employer doesn't accommodate the kind of religious expression of someone. And that might include their beliefs, but it might also include their practices. And so that could include something like a head covering, for example. But where this really comes into play in relation to mindfulness is that second aspect of the potential for reverse discrimination. And so here, the concern is with any kind of an imposition of either beliefs or of practices, and specifically like this set of provisions says practices count as potentially religious, regardless of whether belief statements are connected with those practices or not. And specifically, the language included is they single out the examples of meditation and yoga, and they frame them as New Age. And so the language of this is somewhat dated, but still in force. And what gets specified is that even if the intention of the employer is to improve motivation, cooperation, productivity, secular kinds of goals, and even if both the company and almost every single employee in that company is convinced that this kind of mindfulness or MBSR or meditation is purely secular, or this kind of yoga is purely secular, even if everyone except for one individual in that company is convinced that this is all secular, it cannot legally be required of an individual who says that there's a conflict of religious beliefs. So those of you in a workplace, like non-educational workplace setting, that's really the legal provision that's most relevant for you. And so in that sort of a context, it could be a religious program as long as it's not being imposed, right? It could be an explicitly Buddhist program if you don't get pushback on other grounds for that being the case. Or it could even be an opt-out program legally. So even though I'm going to advocate for opt-in, I don't think legally, and I'm not speaking here as a legal expert, and so that's my kind of disclaimer is I'm interested in law. I've studied some law courses. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not giving legal advice, and I'm not kind of giving you clearance for your programs. But really, it's a very simple kind of don't force people to do it, even if you think it's secular. So that's in terms of workplaces. Education is a more complicated situation, and that's because for the most part, education is mandatory. Like there's ways you can kind of get out of it, but generally it's mandatory to have education. And these are young, impressionable people who are in kind of especially kind of primary or secondary kind of pre-college situations. And so there's a general provision, which is in the Constitution of the First Amendment. And I referenced this morning, that there's actually two clauses. One is the free exercise clause, that people have a right to practice the religion. And that would include like having an explicitly Buddhist group or an explicitly Christian group. Like kids can do that in the school. There's a protection for that. But what's also and relevant here for school-based programs is the Establishment Clause, which is that Congress, and here this is taken by the courts to include public schools as representatives of government. They can't have a law or a program, again, by interpretation of the courts, a school program would be incorporated in this. There can't be an establishment of religion, and that's been interpreted quite broadly as there can't be support or an endorsement of anything that's religious in terms of a public school program. And most of the court cases that have kind of been around religion kind of issues have been prisons and they've been schools because of vulnerable populations. And so the landmark case of Engel versus Vital in 1962 held that even if prayer, and it was specifically a Christian prayer case, even if it's voluntary, it's coercive because there's peer pressure, there's the authority of teachers. So it's hard to opt out. Even if you allow it, there's still a concern of the courts that that's going to be coercive, and therefore that's not permissible. Another landmark case the following year, the case of School District of Abington Township v. Shemp. Schools can teach about religion, but they can't encourage religious practice. So you actually could talk all about the Buddhist foundations of mindfulness if you're kind of transfer from the Christian context to a mindfulness context. But what might actually be more problematic is the practice without the teaching. So it's kind of backwards from what you might expect to be the case, but it's all about, like, schools are all about informing people about lots of things, but it's where government is seen as encouraging or inhibiting particular practices that the courts start to become concerned. Then another kind of lot of landmark court cases, Lemon v. Kurtzman developed what became known as the Lemon Test. And this was over Catholic parochial schools. And what the court found here is that there's three criteria that are kind of tests for evaluating the constitutionality of a school program. First of all, the purpose has to be secular. But secondly, regardless of whether the purpose is secular, the more the sticking point comes with prongs number 2 and 3. And that is that the primary or the principle, the main effect can neither advance nor inhibit religion. So regardless of intentions, if the effect is something that is either supporting or hurting religious practice, then that's going to be unconstitutional by that test. And then third, there can't be an excessive government entanglement. And the courts are kind of careful in saying the word excessive because there's no way to completely get rid of every connection to religion. And so that is kind of the courts are making kind of subjective determinations. So in terms of education law, it's not only kind of an issue of you can't force practices that are religious, but that's where kind of what I'll be talking about in terms of an opt-in is a much more constitutionally safe approach because you don't have the issues of implicit coercion and pressure that you do when someone can opt out, but it takes an extra effort to do so. So those are the two legal contexts in terms of how do you make your program something that's going to kind of not kind of incur litigations. And like it or not, the courts have decided that they get to decide what's religious. It's not the practitioners who get to make that determination. And so here, Malnak v. Yogi, this one was not a Supreme Court decision, but a federal appellate court case. And what the court found here was that even if there's an elective high school course in transcendental meditation, and even it's presented with lots of like scientific papers and claims that this is science, this isn't religion, the court found it's religious. And therefore, it's not even allowed as an elective in a public school setting. And the reasoning of the court was, well, we just said, like in that Lemon case, that Roman Catholics can't get aid from the federal government. So why should transcendental meditators be able to get aid? And there is actually an ongoing court case in the Chicago public schools over transcendental meditation. And every indication in terms of the preliminary rulings has been that, again, TM is going to be found unconstitutional in that setting. Another case, U.S. v. Myers. In this instance, there was a prisoner who wanted to say that he belonged to the Church of Marijuana. And the court said, we're not convinced that one's actually religion. You just want to use marijuana. And so for good or for ill, the courts do make determinations as to what counts as religious practice. And legal criteria have been established by the courts through these sets of rulings that I've mentioned over what that looks like. So the courts are looking for, is there kind of an ultimate sense to the ideas that are being presented? Like, what's the origin of the universe? Kind of what's the nature of the person? What's the nature of reality, or kind of what happens, right? Those are the ultimate kinds of questions. Secondly, is it comprehensive, or is it just like, I want to do marijuana, or is it kind of a bigger kind of worldview? Third, the courts look for kind of analogies to recognized religions. And so they said, well, it's not like this is a checklist where you have to have like anywhere from like 1 to 10 of these to kind of count. But if you have these things, those kind of are tilting in the direction of something being religious. And so it would be like an enlightened founder, mantras or scriptures, gathering places, kind of specialized keepers of knowledge, any kind of like ceremony or ritual, leadership hierarchies, holidays, food rules, appearance and clothing rules, or kind of a kind of interest and passion in propagation and missions or proselytizing. Like, everyone should be doing this. We need to get the word out and get more people involved. And then fourth would be metaphysical beliefs, or any kind of belief that is like more than something physical exists. Like, so any kind of like energy that's kind of more than what's kind of physical energy, or any kind of moral or ethical system, like values, kind of ethical behaviors. These are all things that the courts are looking at when they're determining whether a program is kind of religious and therefore subject to either the First Amendment or the Title VII in terms of corporate settings. So let's take a look then specifically at MBSR. We've made a few references to this kind of in the last few sessions, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with the history of the program, so it's Kabat-Zinn who kind of started this off in terms of like really popularizing. He coined the term mindfulness-based stress reduction in 1979, and he described himself as a Dharma teacher who did not actually identify himself as a Buddhist. So this was later, kind of once he felt safe kind of disclosing more of what he was really quiet about early on. This is kind of what he said he was up to. And he said that he wanted to take something that was as sacred as Buddha Dharma, and notice kind of like the capital V, lowercase d in that instance, and bring it into the world in a way that does not dilute, profane, or distort it. So he wanted real kind of Buddha Dharma, but he wanted to find a way to have it be culturally acceptable in a way that it just really wasn't back in the 1970s. And he purposely and explicitly defined mindfulness as being a really flexible, useful term because it can do, in his words, double duty. It sounds like just really normal, right? You're just paying attention. But it also subsumes, in his idea, all of the other elements of the Eightfold Noble Paths, and I'll kind of go into that on the next slide. It's an umbrella term that has like multiple effects, and it's intentionally vague in how he was using it. But for Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness is the heart of Buddhist meditation, capital B Buddhist. It is the essence of the Buddhist teachings. And he also saw stress as a very kind of like useful umbrella sort of term because it is a medical diagnosis, but it also is a translation of dukkha or suffering. And so he had more in mind than simply something medical. And so he described what he was doing as skillful means, kind of referring to a kind of a Buddhist virtue that you should be skillful. And it was means for bringing the Dharma into mainstream settings. And he described both MBSR and MBCT as, I love this wording, right? Secular Dharma-based portals. So in one mouthful, it's both secular and it's Dharma-based, and it's a portal into this larger world. So that really is kind of this origin point of popularization of MBSR. According to Kabat-Zinn, the underpinnings of MBSR are rooted in Buddhism. And so he claimed that an 8-week MBSR class is a full expression of the essence of the Dhamma or the Dharma. It incorporates and expresses the Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering or dukkha. The origin of suffering is attachment. Suffering can be ended, and it can be ended specifically through the Noble Eightfold Path. I won't read all of the prongs of that, but number 7 in that path is right mindfulness, or samasati. He also claimed that MBSR expresses the 4 foundations that are found in the Satipatthana Sutta. And again, that includes 7 factors of awakening, which prominently starts with mindfulness. MBSR also, according to Kabat-Zinn, inscribes within it the 3 marks of existence: suffering, impermanence, and no self. The 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. The 3 jewels of the Buddha: the Dharma, or the teachings of the Buddha, and the Sangha, or the community. And the 4 virtues of loving kindness, or metta, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And Kabat-Zinn felt like he had to articulate these Buddhist underpinnings because he was being accused of this being like the one-fold noble path or kind of a dilution of the Dharma. So it was Buddhist critics who motivated Kabat-Zinn to say, no, this really is Buddhist, and it's all being communicated, and that's why it's so regimented, and why we have this one way of doing the MBSR class, so that we make sure that we're communicating this whole worldview and this whole set of values, and not just this set of techniques. I'll kind of transition from Kabat-Zinn to another popularizer of mindfulness, particularly in public schools, Goldie Hawn. And she actually came up with a whole curriculum, Mind Up. And if you listen to her, kind of in the curriculum, it says this is all secular, but she also described what she was doing for Buddhist audiences. And so, for instance, in a talk at the Dalai Lama Center for Peace Education, she said, here is what I am really doing. And you can listen to her on YouTube. This is still available. I'm replacing Buddhism and meditation with neuroscience and core practice. And the reason I'm doing this is to get Buddhist meditation into the classroom under a different name. And her mission for Mind Up was for Mind Up to be absolutely mandated in every public school classroom for every kid, every teacher. I'm just quoting from Goldie Hawn. Daniel Goleman in the Inquiring Mind said that the Dharma is so disguised it could never be proven in court. Kenneth Folk in the Trojan Horse of Meditation said it is a stealth move to sneak in Buddhist values of compassion and empathy because it's good for the corporate world to do this. Or here is Trudy Goodman on the BuddhistGeeks.com podcast. This one you've got to go to Web Archives to find because they took it down. Actually, they took down the Kenneth Folk one, too. So here's what she said, though, in a kind of interview this is transcribed from. I really wanted us to be able to work in this community, to go into hospitals and universities and schools and places where as Buddhists we might not be so welcome, especially state places, which is appropriate since we have the separation of church and state. The really interesting question is, what do they do after they take that class? They aren't that different from our Buddhist classes. We just use a different vocabulary. Will people then sort of migrate into Buddhism? Well, some will, some won't. Anyone who practices sincerely, whether they want it or not, they are going to discover more deeply other dimensions of their being. I think it's inevitable if they keep practicing, don't you? And here the next part is the interviewer who said, yeah, that seems to be somewhat independent of whether it's framed in a Buddhist context or in a new non-Buddhist Buddhist context, and then goes back to Goodman saying, my former husband George, he used to call it crypto-Buddhism, stealth Buddhism, we now might say. So I did not coin the phrase stealth Buddhism. It was kind of coined by the people who were promoting stealth Buddhism. So suggestions then for how we can kind of go about this more ethically is to volunteer full disclosures that there are challenging effects like those researched by the Britton and Linda lab at Brown. That can include an increase in anxiety, depression, physical pain, traumatic memories, aggression, suicidality. There can be contradictions or contraindications for the practice, such as a history of trauma, PTSD, abuse, depression, suicidality, addiction, and psychological disorders. And here I'll just kind of mention MBSR has been much better about looking for contraindications than some of the school-based programs where they kind of say, we're not going to talk about that. We just want everyone to do the program. Full disclosures might include the fact that there are alternatives to doing mindfulness, and there is scientific research for the benefits of aerobic exercise, taking a nap, listening or playing music, mental challenge like arithmetic or algebra, good nutrition. And it's also important to note that a practice can have health benefits and also be religious, right? It's not necessarily an either or thing. And this is what the courts were dealing with transcendental meditation. You may have scientific studies, but if it's also religious, that's still going to cause the same legal issues. Practices can change beliefs. And this gets at it's not just the intentions, but it's also the effects. So here's someone who's just posting on a web blog or kind of response to an online article who said, well, I took an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course 2 years ago without knowing anything about Buddhism. That program spurred my curiosity, and here I am learning all about the Four Noble Truths. So he didn't mind this. This wasn't a bad thing for him, but it was an exposure. He came to Buddhism through MBSR, didn't expect to do so. There have been research studies which support this kind of association. So a study of long-term meditators, after 17 months of meditation, 20% were monotheists, 60% said they had no religion, 20% said they were Buddhist. But after 105 months of meditation, the number of monotheists went down, only 13%, 25%, so that also went down, so they had no religion. Number of Buddhists went up to 38%, and then 25% said that they believe in all religions. So religious change it's a correlation, not necessarily a cause, but there are a lot of these correlational studies. Another study found that most people who enrolled in a secular MBSR class wanted better mental health, stress management, physical health. Half wanted deeper spirituality, but more than half reported that they got more spirituality, which they defined in a number of ways in terms of faith, meaning, higher powers, interconnection with all things. And interestingly, the study found that the mental health benefits, and they did find mental health benefits, they resulted from this increase in daily spiritual experiences. They weren't independent. So to get the benefits, you need to have the spirituality, which is interesting for a secular MBSR program that claims to not have spiritual connections to it. There have also been conscientious objectors to mindfulness programs, and this has included Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, and Buddhists who have said, I don't want to do this because this conflicts with my spirituality. There have been school teachers who have lost their jobs, both in Canada and in the United States, explicitly because they refused to teach mindfulness in their classrooms when everyone in the school or the school district was doing so. Kids can opt out. Teachers often can't opt out. It's harder to do that from that perspective. Lawsuits have been threatened, and so we've made mention of Calmer Choice in Massachusetts. Also, the American Center for Law and Justice have kind of thought about bringing lawsuits. That no one actually has kind of pursued those. And the issue here is respect. Apart from lawsuits, I would say the ethical issue is respect for culturally and religiously diverse values and worldviews, whether or not you think people are right in those worldviews. So you may think this is all kind of like transparently, obviously secular. Not everyone thinks that life is suffering. Some would say life is good. Or if there is suffering, it's not because of attachment, but it's because of disobedience to God. We should be judging the difference between right and wrong. We should actually desire things. We should desire good. We should hate evil. The self is permanent. We should remember the past, and we should hope for the future. We should actually embrace suffering through sacrifice. We should have compassion, but for someone who's other rather than someone who's interconnected with us. These are like pretty different, like they're similar values, right? But the assumptions that go into them can actually be pretty different. And so it's helpful to recognize that what seems self-evident to you, us, might not be self-evident to everyone who's being asked to participate in a program. So which do you cultivate if you have a mindfulness program? Here's option one, and I jumped onto the AI bandwagon here. And this is the COOP, coercive, opt-out, and passive. Everyone should be doing it. A little cooped up in doing that. Or vital choice. Here's my new coinage for the day. It's voluntary, informed, transparent, active, because opt-out tends to be pretty passive. Like you've got to like take an active choice to get out of it, but opt-in, you actively choose to do it. It's legal. It's clear about what you're doing. It's healthy. One might say, I might say, it's opt-in. It involves consent, and it's ethical. So, same program, but more kind of possibility to choose to participate or not participate. So here's my best practice recommendations. Offer programs on a voluntary opt-in versus opt-out, no pressure basis. Now, I know it's harder to get people involved in the opt-in. I know you may have financial concerns. I know you may think it's good for people. Everyone should be doing it. Even if you don't legally have to do it, I would argue or suggest that it's more ethical to make it opt-in despite the challenges. Make it no pressure. Secondly, volunteer full disclosures in one-on-one informed consent interviews. I know that's time-consuming, that's difficult. We'd have to figure out how do you do that in a way that works. But I would say it's more ethical. Limit instruction and practice to designated time outside of work hours. Could be lunch, could be before, could be after. But once it's in work hours, you're getting all kinds of employer-employee or teacher-student kinds of power dynamics in play. And avoid the metaphysical, whether that's concepts of non-duality, impermanence, interconnection, language like loving-kindness, metascripts, chakras, mantras, om, symbols like Tibetan singing bowls, energy chimes, mandalas. And yeah, the history of Tibetan singing bowls, they actually didn't start off religion. That's kind of a whole story of its own, but they become associated with religious stuff. Gestures like mudras, praying hands, wisdom gesture, gazing points, postures, yoga sun salutations, lotus or corpse, which can invoke deities' enlightenment. That's a whole nother talk kind of right there. But once you, especially kind of sequences of postures can have kinds of at least connotations, and some might argue kind of spiritual, kind of metaphysical energies that are at play in them. But bottom line, accommodate objections, even if you're sure that it's secular. And that's kind of where this lands. Voluntary, opt-in, informed consent, at least accommodate objections and don't make this mandatory. But even better if you have the vital choice of making it actually optional. So more information, the Debating Yoga and Mindfulness book, they've got available out at the bookstore. I do a more general discussion of different kinds of alternative healing, including things like acupuncture and Reiki and chiropractic and a bunch of other stuff in the Healing Gods. And then for kind of Christian spiritual practices, I write about those in Testing Prayer and in Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Healing. I'll be around for the rest of today and for parts of tomorrow, and I'd be happy to talk with anyone who'd like to have further conversation. But thank you so very much.